Dante Ravello sent that text at 5:38 p.m. emergency surgery. One of my men. I'll be here all night. Don't wait up. Serafina read it twice. She was already in the elevator, already rising toward the 7th floor, the small anniversary gift wrapped in dark paper, balanced against her pregnant belly. 12 years. She had driven 40 minutes through Friday rain to surprise him. She thought about turning back. She didn't. And that 4-minute walk down a hospital corridor, the squeak of her heels on polished tile, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead changed everything she thought she knew about her life. Because through the glass wall of the private donor lounge, Dante Ravello was not in surgery. He was kissing someone else, and the woman in his arms was one of the only people Serafina had ever truly trusted. If this kind of story moves you the kind that makes you question everything you thought was solid, subscribe right now and follow this story all the way to the end. You will not want to miss what happens next. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since noon. Not the dramatic kind that announces itself with thunder and turns the streets into rivers. The quiet kind, the kind that just settles in, gray and patient, as if it has nowhere better to be. Serafina noticed the way she noticed most things lately, peripherally, between thoughts, while her mind was already 3 steps ahead of her body. She had nearly canceled the trip twice. The first time was when her back seized up climbing out of bed that morning, a dull, grinding pressure across her lower spine that her obstetrician had already told her to expect at 22 weeks. She sat on the edge of the mattress for a moment, pressing one hand flat against her side, breathing the way the midwife had shown her, counting slowly until the discomfort passed. By the time it did, Dante had already left. The bedroom smelled faintly of his cologne, and the coffee he'd made himself downstairs the strong, bitter kind, the kind she couldn't drink anymore. She missed coffee more than she expected to. The second time she almost canceled was at 4:15, when she pulled up the hospital's parking structure on her phone and saw that the closest available level was 3 floors above the entrance. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment, her thumb hovering over her contacts, thinking about calling him instead. Just telling him she had a gift, that it could wait until the weekend. That she was tired. But Serafina Vale had spent enough years watching other women make that call, the sensible call, the practical call, and then wonder, years later, if the small retreats had added up to something larger. She was not someone who made the small retreats. She wrapped the gift herself. Dark paper, no ribbon. Dante always said ribbons were unnecessary, and she'd stopped buying them around year 4. She wrote his name on the tag in her own handwriting, the way she always did, and she left the house. The drive took 43 minutes, not 40. Traffic on the bridge. She sat in the backup with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, because the baby had been moving since morning, in a rolling, insistent way that made her want quiet. She had read somewhere that babies could feel their mother's stress. She wasn't sure she believed it entirely, but she wasn't willing to test it either. She parked on the 3rd level, took the elevator down. Signed in at the front desk under her own name because she was a recognized donor, and that was easier than explaining why she was there. The woman at the desk gave her a visitor badge and said something warm and generic about her pregnancies, and Serafina smiled the way she had learned to smile at those comments, genuinely enough not to seem cold, quickly enough not to invite more conversation. The 7th floor was quiet at that hour. The administrative offices were winding down for the weekend. The hallway stretched ahead of her, glossy and faintly amber under the overhead lighting, the kind of institutional light that makes everyone look slightly tired. She had walked that hallway before. She had stood in the boardroom at the end of it and presented before a committee when the hospital first integrated Axiom Route into its emergency logistics system. She knew the layout the way she knew most things she'd built from the inside out. She was looking down at her phone when she passed the first set of glass panels. She almost kept walking, but something made her look up. Later, she would not be able to explain what it was. Not a sound, not movement. Something closer to pressure the way a room changes when something important is happening in it, even before you understand what you're seeing. The private donor lounge was a room set aside for major contributors to the hospital's foundation. Comfortable furniture, framed artwork that cost more than most people's cars, a small bar along the far wall, mostly decorative. The kind of room that said money without using any of the words associated with it. Dante was standing near the far window. His back was not quite to the glass. He was angled slightly, the way people position themselves almost when they've chosen a spot that feels private, but haven't thought carefully enough about sightlines. His left hand was around the waist of the woman beside him. Not at her back in a polite or professional way around her waist, settled there, familiar, the way a hand lands when it has landed in exactly that place many times before. The woman was Celeste Marrow. Serafina knew Celeste's profile without needing to see her face. The way she stood, the precise angle of her shoulders. She had seen Celeste stand in her own kitchen, in her living room, at her dining table. She had seen her reach across that table to pour wine into Serafina's glass and say something quietly funny that made Dante laugh. She had seen Celeste hold the door open at charity events, lean in to whisper something in Serafina's ear during long speeches, text her at 10:30 on a Tuesday to ask if she wanted lunch. Celeste's fingers were tucked beneath the edge of Dante's jacket. Dante kissed her the way you kiss someone you are not afraid of losing. That was what Serafina noticed. Not the kiss itself, though it landed in her chest, like something physical, something with weight and edge, but the ease of it. The complete practiced, unhurried ease. There was no guilt in it. No performance, no urgency that suggested stolen time. Just two people in a room they believed was private, moving together the way people move when they've been doing this long enough that it's become ordinary. Serafina's hand went to her belly before she told it to. She stood there for what was probably 10 seconds, but felt like something that didn't have a unit of measurement. Her vision did something strange at the edges, not blurring, more like a sharpening, an overfocus, the way the eye behaves when the brain is trying too hard to confirm what it's seeing. She did not make a sound. That surprised her later, when she thought about it. She had always assumed, not consciously, not in words, but in the vague way people carry assumptions about themselves, that if something like this happened, she would react loudly. That she was the kind of woman who would move immediately, who would push through doors and speak first. She had built a company from nothing. She had sat across from men who underestimated her in contract negotiations and watched their expressions shift when they realized the miscalculation. She was not someone who went quiet, but she went quiet. She took out her phone. Her hands were steadier than they had any right to be. She raised the camera slowly, the way you'd raise it for any ordinary shot of you, a piece of art, something worth keeping. She photographed what was in front of her. Then she opened Dante's text emergency surgery. One of my men. I'll be here all night. And she took a screenshot of that too. She looked at both images on her screen for a moment, side by side in her memory, if not literally, her husband's lie in his own words, and the proof of what that lie was covering. Then, very deliberately, she opened the location sharing app. Dante had insisted on it 3 years ago. He'd framed it as protection. He had concerns about her safety, real concerns. He said, legitimate ones given the world he moved in. She had accepted it the way she accepted many things, not entirely comfortable, but understanding the logic, trusting the man offering the explanation. She had been location sharing with Dante for 3 years without once thinking to resent it. She disabled it in 4 taps. She was not sure yet what she was going to do. She was not sure of much. But she was absolutely certain that whatever happened next, she was going to decide it for herself, and she was going to decide it clearly. And she was not going to do anything in the next 60 seconds that she couldn't take back. She turned from the glass. The elevator behind her opened. A man stepped out, tall, unhurried, in a dark overcoat, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to move through powerful spaces without announcing themselves. Cassian Rourke. She knew him, the way she knew several people in Dante's extended orbit, professionally, cautiously, with the awareness that his presence in any room was never entirely accidental. He looked at her face. Then he looked past her, at the donor lounge. Then he looked at her face again. He understood in roughly the same amount of time it takes to draw a breath. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say anything that was about himself or what he was feeling. He just asked her the only question that mattered in that moment. Do you want him to know you saw? She considered it. The question deserved real consideration. Not yet. Cassian held the elevator door with one hand. He didn't speak again. Didn't offer comfort. Didn't try to fill the silence. Serafina stepped past him into the elevator car, and the doors began to close. And that was when her phone buzzed. Not Dante. Not a call from downstairs. Not a second lie stacking on top of the first. The notification was from Axiom Route, her system, her architecture, the emergency logistics platform she had spent 4 years building before it was acquired, the infrastructure that ran in the background of 17 hospital networks, and didn't sleep, and didn't lie, and didn't need anything from her tonight except her attention. Unauthorized export attempt. Temporary credentials D. Ravello. Destination device flagged. Review required. She read it once. She read it again. The destination device. She cross-referenced the device ID against Axiom's registered user database before the elevator reached the ground floor. Her thumbs moved fast, the way they moved when she was solving something, when the part of her brain that had built a company from a concept in a notebook was running faster than the part of her brain that was processing what she'd just seen through a pane of hospital glass. The destination device was registered to Celeste Marrow. Serafina stood in the elevator as the doors opened onto the lobby. Rain pressed against the entrance doors. People moved around her. She didn't move for a moment. The affair was devastating. The affair was the kind of thing that breaks open the floor beneath a person, that makes 12 years feel suddenly like a hallway full of rooms you didn't know existed. But this was something different. This was not a betrayal of the heart. This was a theft. She drove home through the rain. She didn't call anyone. Didn't turn on the radio this time either. The baby moved again somewhere on the highway, a slow, rolling shift, the way he sometimes settled in when she was still. She pressed one hand against her side for a moment, briefly, then put it back on the wheel. She was thinking. She was very good at thinking. Dante had said that once, early on, in a way that was meant as a compliment and landed as one. You're the calmest problem solver I've ever met. He'd meant it about her professional life, a negotiation that had collapsed, and that she had rebuilt in 3 hours through a combination of patience and strategic retreat that left everyone at the table feeling like they'd won. He had admired it. She thought about that now, about what it meant to be admired for a quality, and then depend on that quality being unavailable. The Ravello estate was quiet when she arrived. The housekeeper had gone home. The lights in the lower rooms were on a timer. Serafina let herself in through the side entrance, the one closest to the kitchen, the one she used when she didn't want to deal with the formal entry, the high ceilings, the portraits on the wall, the accumulated weight of Ravello family history, asserting itself from every surface. She went to her office. She did not pour wine. She did not pour anything. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and she began to look. The Axiom Route administrative backend was something she could still access. She had retained audit-level visibility as part of the acquisition agreement, a detail Dante had been present for during the negotiation, a detail she had insisted on, and that his attorney had tried twice to remove from the draft. She remembered that conversation. She remembered Dante afterward, telling the attorney was just being thorough. She had agreed with him at the time. Now she pulled up the complete access log. 23 unauthorized entries in 31 days. Each one using the temporary credentials she had provided Dante months ago when he'd complained that he couldn't access certain shared files for a board presentation. She had generated those credentials herself, set them to expire after 2 weeks, and then, and this was the part that sat in her chest, with particular weight she had extended them when he asked her to. He said he still needed access. She had believed him. She cross-referenced each entry against the file manifests. The protected modules were not presentation files. They were not administrative documents. They were core architecture, the routing logic, the decision tree framework, The emergency prioritization protocol. The bones of Axiom route. The parts that had taken her 18 months and 2 failed prototypes to get right. She did not block the credentials. She sat there for a long moment, looking at the screen, and made a decision that was either the coldest or the clearest thing she had ever done. She activated silent monitoring instead. If Dante and Celeste still believed the door was open, they would keep walking through it. Every time they walked through it, the system would log the entry with a precision that no attorney in the world could argue with. She did not want to stop them tonight. She wanted to watch them, carefully and quietly, until she understood the full shape of what they were doing. The younger version of herself, the one from before the company, before the marriage, before any of this, would not have been capable of that kind of stillness. Yeah. She knew that. The younger Serafina would have called someone immediately, would have needed to put the pain somewhere outside herself the moment it arrived. 12 years had taught her many things, some of them good, some of them not, and one of them was how to stay in a room with something terrible and not run from it until she was ready. She was not ready yet. She closed the laptop. And she went to bed in the room she shared with her husband, in the house that bore his family name, and she lay there in the dark, with her hand flat against her stomach and the rain still pressing against the windows, and she waited. He came home at 12:47. She heard the front door, then his footsteps in the entry, then the sound of him in the kitchen opening the refrigerator, setting something down, the particular domestic sounds that had been the backdrop of 12 years of evenings. She had told him once, years ago, that she always slept better when she heard those sounds, that something in her nervous system released when she knew he was home. She lay very still. He came upstairs. He moved through the bathroom. She heard the water running. When he appeared in the doorway, he was wearing the medical scrubs he kept at the hospital for exactly this kind of night, layered over the anniversary shirt she had chosen for him herself. Dark blue. She had picked it because it matched his eyes when he was tired. He thought she was asleep. She let him think so for a moment. Then she said quietly, "How was the surgery?" He didn't startle. Dante Ravello never startled. It was one of the things she had once found reassuring about him, the steadiness, the control. A man who didn't rattle. Long, he said. He sat on the edge of the bed and began to pull off his shoes. Complicated, but he's stable. I'm glad. He leaned over and pressed a kiss to her temple. His lips were warm. He smelled like hospital soap, and beneath that, something else, something faint that she recognized and did not name. Not yet. Go back to sleep, he said. I was never asleep. Something shifted in the room, very slightly, the way the air changes before weather. She reached over to the nightstand. The photograph was face down. She had printed it before coming to bed, a decision she was still slightly surprised by, because she was not generally a person who printed things. But something in her understood that a phone screen could be grabbed, that a phone screen could be argued with. Paper was different. Paper sat on a surface and did not move. She turned it over. She placed it between them. Dante looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. His face did not collapse the way faces do. In movies, no sudden crumbling, no immediate remorse. He was too controlled for that. Instead, he was very still, and she watched something move behind his eyes that she couldn't entirely name. And she understood in that moment that whatever he was calculating it fast. Serafina, he told her, 7 months. Hotels that appeared on the schedule as negotiations. Dinners that appeared as security briefings. Nights when he had come home and placed his hand over the child growing inside her. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Look at your phone." He looked at her instead. "Look at your phone," she said again. He took it out slowly. She watched him navigate to the Axiom backend. She watched him try his credentials. The system let him in. She had left the door open on purpose. He looked up at her with something she couldn't immediately identify, and then she could, because she had seen it once before in a negotiation room across town, on the face of a man who had just realized the deal he thought he'd made was not the deal he'd actually made. It was the look of someone who understood they had miscalculated. "That was not yours to take," Serafina said. He began with the argument she expected: marriage, shared property, the Ravello name and what it had provided. His attorney would later construct this argument much more carefully, in much cleaner language, with precedents attached. But Dante, in his bedroom at 12:47 in the morning with his anniversary shirt visible beneath stolen hospital scrubs, said it plainly: "What's mine is mine, Serafina, and what's yours became part of this family the day you married into it." She had wondered, on the drive home, how she would feel when she heard him say something like that out loud. She had half expected devastation. Instead, she felt something much quieter, something that had edges. "Marriage gave you access to my life," she said. "It never gave you ownership of it." He had nothing to say to that. She had known he wouldn't. She turned off the lamp on her side of the bed. In the dark, she listened to him breathe, and she thought about everything she needed to do in the morning, and she did not sleep until nearly 4, and when she finally did, she dreamed of nothing at all. She was up before 5. Not because the baby woke her, not because the alarm she'd set and then canceled went off anyway, but because her body had apparently decided that sleep was finished and there was nothing left to negotiate about it. She lay in the gray pre-dawn, with her eyes open, for maybe 3 minutes, listening to Dante breathe beside her slow, even the way he always slept, with the infuriating consistency of a man whose conscience did not apparently and then she got up. She moved quietly, not for his sake, for hers. She needed the kitchen to herself. The coffee maker was programmed to run at 6. She stood in front of it and watched it do nothing for a moment, then manually started it, then stood there watching it drip because she needed something to look at that wasn't complicated. Outside the kitchen windows, the estate grounds were still dark and wet from the night's rain. A security light near the east gate threw a pale cone across the gravel driveway. She watched a single dead leaf cross through it on the wind. She drank water instead of coffee. She had been drinking water instead of coffee for 5 months, and she was still not used to it, and this morning, the absence of it felt like a specific kind of insult layered on top of everything else. By 7:15, she had made 3 calls. The first was to Mara Ellison, who was the kind of attorney people retained when they were serious, not about winning, but about not losing ground they didn't know they had yet. Mara's assistant said she was available at 9. Serafina said she'd be there at 9 exactly. She was. The second call was to Jonas Creed, who had built his reputation in cybersecurity by thinking the way the people he was hired to stop actually thought, and who had grown up in the same lower Manhattan world as several of Dante's associates, which meant that when Serafina called him with this particular problem, he understood both the technical dimension and the surrounding terrain without needing either explained. She reached him directly. She laid it out in 10 minutes, clean and precise. He went quiet for a moment at the end. 23 entries, he said, in 31 days, and the destination device. Celeste Marrow, I've confirmed it twice. He let out a slow breath. Not dramatic, just the sound of someone who was recalibrating. I'll need back-end access. You have it as of 8 this morning. The third call was the shortest. She left a message for the head of Axiom's independent governance board, informing him that she was initiating a precautionary audit under the terms of the acquisition agreement. She kept her voice level. She had spoken in boardrooms and courtrooms and hospital ballrooms, and she knew exactly how to keep her voice level, regardless of what was happening in her chest. She did not call Celeste. She thought about it, briefly, specifically in the way you think about pressing on a bruise just to confirm it still hurts. She thought about what she might say and what Celeste might say back, and what it would feel like to hear Celeste's voice on the phone, knowing what she knew. She put the phone face down on the kitchen counter. She was not ready for that, and she was going to be very careful going forward about the difference between what she felt ready for and what actually needed to happen. Dante found her at the kitchen island at 8. He was showered, dressed. He had put on a jacket, which was something he only did when he was preparing to be seen by staff, associates, by the world outside these walls. He had the look of a man who had decided, sometime during the night, exactly how this morning was going to go. He poured himself coffee. He stood across the island from her and drank it, and looked at her over the rim of the cup. "I'd like to talk," he said. "I have meetings at 9. Serafina, I'll be back by noon." She closed her laptop, gathered the 3 documents she'd been reviewing, slid them into the leather folder she carried everywhere. "You can talk then, or you can have your attorney talk to mine. Either way works for me." That landed. She could see it land. "You called an attorney." I called Mara Ellison. Something moved through his expression that was not quite alarm and not quite respect, but lived in the neighborhood of both. He set the coffee cup down. "That's a significant escalation for 8 o'clock in the morning." "I know what it is." "Serafina, what happened last night was, there are things I need to explain to you that you don't have the full context for." "I have the photographs," she said. "I have the screenshots. I have 23 access logs time-stamped to the minute with the files transferred to each session. I have the device registration for Celeste Marrow." She said Celeste name the way you'd say the name of someone who was no longer in the room. "Factually, without heat. The context I'm missing, Dante, is not about what happened. It's about when it started and how deliberate it was. Those are the things I'll be working to find out." He put both hands flat on the counter. Not aggressive, deliberate. Like he was steadying something. "This doesn't have to become a war." "I know." She picked up her folder. "You could have thought of that sooner." She left him in the kitchen. Mara Ellison's office was on the 34th floor of a building that did not display its tenant list in the lobby, which was the kind of detail that told you everything you needed to know about the caliber of the people who worked there. Mara herself was 62, compact, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses she wore on a chain that she'd remove and set on the desk whenever she needed you to understand that she was looking at you without them for a reason. She set them on the desk now. "Walk me through the access logs." Serafina walked her through the access logs. Mara took notes with a fountain pen in a leather-bound pad. She did not use a laptop in client meetings, which she said was partly a habit and partly a statement. She asked questions in a flat, procedural tone, not cold, but clean, the way a surgeon speaks during a procedure. She did not express sympathy, and she did not express outrage. She gathered information. At the end, she capped the pen. "The marriage predates the acquisition," she said. "His attorneys will argue commingled interest. The acquisition agreement has a carve-out. My attorney negotiated it at the time. Axiom Route's core architecture was explicitly protected from marital property claims. It was a non-negotiable condition of the deal." Mara looked at her over the absent glasses. "He signed the acquisition agreement?" "He was present for every meeting. He signed the final document as a witness to my signature." A pause. "He signed as a witness. He knows what he signed. And he knows what was in it." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We can file for a temporary injunction to stop any public presentation of the stolen architecture. We could have a hearing by Thursday." Serafina shook her head. Mara waited. "I want them to stand up in front of everyone," Serafina said. "I want them at the podium. I want cameras and hospital executives and investors and consortium representatives in the room, and I want Dante and Celeste to look out at all of those people and tell them that Dominion Sentinel is theirs." Mara studied her. "That is a very specific kind of justice you're describing." "I know what I'm describing. It's also a significant risk. If something goes wrong between now and the presentation, nothing will go wrong. Jonas is monitoring everything in real time. The moment they try to use the architecture in any live system, we stop them. But until they step to that podium, I want the door to stay open." Another pause. "Longer." "All right," Mara said. She put the glasses back on and picked up the pen. "Then let's talk about what we build while the door stays open." She was back at the estate by 12:15. Dante was not in the main house. His car was gone. This was not unusual. He moved constantly, had meetings she never knew the full details of, kept a schedule that was deliberately opaque even to his own staff. She had accepted this as part of the architecture of his life. She understood now that she had accepted many things as architecture when they were actually choices. She went upstairs. She opened the closet that held her maternity clothes, the ones she'd bought reluctantly. The ones that felt like a concession to a body that was changing faster than she could emotionally negotiate with, and she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them for a while, without moving. Then she took out her phone and called Dante's mother. Evelina Ravello was 71 years old and had been surviving the men in her family for most of them. She answered on the second ring the way she always did, as if she'd been expecting the call regardless of who was making it. Serafina, Evelina, a silence between them that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable. They had spent 12 years in a relationship that was warm in specific bounded ways. Evelina had never been unkind, had never been hostile, had respected Serafina's intelligence in a way that most of Dantasani's family hadn't. But there was always a distance, a withheld quality. The sense that Evelina kept certain rooms in herself closed. "I imagine," Evelina said carefully, "that you're not calling to discuss the weather." "Did he tell you?" "Not in useful terms." "Then let me." She told her. Not everything, not the technical details, not the access logs, but the essential shape of it, the affair, the theft, the photograph. Evelina was quiet throughout. No exclamations, no protestations. She breathed steadily on the other end of the line, and Serafina could picture her exactly sitting at the table in the Ravello family home in Carroll Gardens. The one she'd refused to leave even after Dante bought the estate, with a cup of tea she'd probably let go cold. When Serafina finished, Evelina was quiet for another moment. "He's asked me to sign something," she said finally. Her voice had changed, lost something, a declaration, saying that Axiom was always developed with Ravello family guidance and resources. Serafina's grip tightened on the phone. And I haven't signed it." Evelina's voice was steady and very tired. "And I won't." Serafina closed her eyes for a second. "There's more," Evelina said. "I kept things. Messages. From years ago when Dante first started talking about your company. The things he said about it then." She stopped. "Evelina. He called it your expensive little obsession." She said it flat. No cushioning. More than once. To me, to his uncle, to anyone who'd listen. He thought it would fail. He thought you'd get tired of it. The room was very quiet. "I kept those messages, because I keep everything," Evelina continued. "I'm not a woman who throws things away, but I want you to know, Serafina, I'm not signing what he asked me to sign. And if those messages would help you, they're yours." "Why are you telling me this?" The pause was long enough that Serafina wondered if she'd crossed a line. Then Evelina said, "Because he's my son, and I know exactly who he is. And there's a baby coming, and somebody in this family should behave like it matters." Jonas called at 3:47. He had a voice that stayed calm, the way a dam stays calm, not because there's no pressure on the other side, but because it was built to hold. When she heard the specific quality of calm he was using now, she sat forward immediately. "I found something," he said. "Tell me." "They're not just presenting the stolen architecture. They've modified it." She was very still. "The human review safeguard," she said. Gone, stripped out entirely. She had built that safeguard into Axiom's emergency routing protocol after 18 months of pressure testing, after 2 simulations in which an automated system, functioning perfectly within its parameters, had made incorrect triage decisions during mass casualty scenarios because it lacked the judgment layer that told it to pause and ask a human. The safeguard was not efficient. That was precisely the point. Efficiency in emergency routing was a false god, and she had spent years arguing that with investors who wanted speed and a system that never said, "Wait, let a person look at this first." She had lost the argument with some of them. She had not removed the safeguard. "The modification makes Dominion Sentinel faster," Jonas said. "Better looking on paper. Their performance metrics are going to seem significantly superior, because they removed the check that exists to catch what the metrics don't measure." "Right." She stood up and walked to the window. The grounds outside were still wet from the previous night. The Eastgate security light was off in the afternoon. Everything looked exactly as it always had, and something in that ordinary stillness made her angry in a way the photographs hadn't. "Someone could be hurt," she said. "In a real-world deployment, during a complex emergency, yes. Potentially." She pressed her fingertips against the cold glass. "How long to document the modification?" "I've already started. I'll have a full forensic trail by end of day." "Good." Keep monitoring, she paused. Jonas. Yeah. Is there anything else in there? The pause on his end was a fraction too long. I'm still looking, he said. I'll call you when I find something. He hung up. She stood at the window for a long time. The affair had been devastating. The theft had been a betrayal of something she had built with her own hands over years of her life. But removing a safeguard designed to keep people alive that was something else. That moved the whole landscape. That made this not just about her marriage, not just about her company, but about the fact that people she had never met, in hospitals she'd never visited, could pay a price for the thing Dante and Celeste were building on the bones of her work. She went to her desk. She pulled up the Axiom Governance Board contact list and began to compose a very carefully worded email. Dante came home at 7. She heard him downstairs, heard him speaking briefly to someone on the phone, one of his lieutenants, based on the short, flat tone, and then the phone call ended, and the house was quiet again, and she heard his footsteps on the stairs. He knocked on the office door, which was new. He had never knocked on this door in 12 years. Come in. He came in. He looked at her set-up laptop, printed logs, the legal folder from Mara's office open on the desk, and he looked at her. He chose the chair opposite the desk, the one she used for conversations she didn't want to have on the couch, the one that felt like the less comfortable choice. That was also new. I spoke to my attorney today, he said. I assumed you would. He says the architecture question is genuinely complicated, that there's a reasonable case on both sides. There isn't, she said without heat. But his job is to tell you there is. Dante leaned forward, elbows on knees. The posture of a man trying to look less powerful than he was, which something she had seen him deploy in negotiations, and which she was now cataloging as a technique rather than a mood. I need you to consider what this looks like, he said. From the outside, a public dispute, the Ravello name involved in a theft allegation. The consortium, your name, she said, not mine. Axiom Route still operates under my founding governance terms. I was very careful about that. You were careful about a lot of things. I was. He looked at her steadily. Were you careful enough? It was a threat, dressed as a question, but a threat. She held his gaze. I was more careful than you know, she said. He studied her for a long moment. She watched him trying to read her, the way he read rooms efficiently, quickly, looking for the pressure point, the opening. He was very good at it. He had always been good at it. He didn't find what he was looking for. Celeste is pregnant. She heard the sentence. She had time, in the half-second after he said it, to observe her own reaction, the way you observe a thing happening, at a slight distance, the particular quality of stillness that moved through her, the way her hands stayed exactly where they were, the way she breathed once, slowly before she said anything. How far along? 11 weeks. 11 weeks. She ran the math automatically, the way her mind ran most things, and the result sat in her chest with a specific heaviness. I need you to consider withdrawing the technology dispute, Dante said. An investigation could threaten her professional standing, her career, her ability to she stole my architecture. She's carrying my child. She is, Serafina agreed. And that child has done nothing wrong. I have no interest in harming an unborn child. She paused. But pregnancy is not immunity, not for the adults around it. Serafina, I will not withdraw the dispute. You can tell her that yourself. He stood. The negotiating posture was gone. She could see the shift, the Ravello estate version of him falling away, and something older, rawer, not exactly frightening, but honest, in a way the other version wasn't. You're going to burn this down, he said. You're going to burn everything. You brought the match home, she said. Don't blame me for the fire. He left. She sat in the office after the door closed, listening to his footsteps recede down the hall. Her heart was beating faster than she would have preferred, but steadily. Her hands were still. 11 weeks, 7 months of affair. 11 weeks of pregnancy. The math of it arranged itself in her mind without her asking it to, and she did not let herself sit with it for long because she could feel the shape of the grief under it, and she needed to stay on the surface of things for a while longer. She opened her laptop. Jonas had sent a preliminary file. She opened it. It took her 12 minutes to read through it fully, and when she reached the last section, she read it again more slowly. Her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the pregnancy, and nothing to do with Celeste, and nothing to do with anything she had imagined being hurt by tonight. The file contained an archived recording, time-stamped 14 months ago. The metadata showed it had been captured during a private meeting, the kind Jonas described as having been inadvertently preserved in a backup server that neither Dante nor Celeste had known was running. Serafina put her earphones in. She pressed play. Dante's voice came through clearly. She had heard that voice every day for 12 years, and she heard it now, saying things that rearranged everything she had already rearranged once tonight. Once the baby comes, she'll step back. Motherhood will change her priorities. She'll want to be present. She'll want to slow down. That's when we move. And then Celeste's voice. She trusts me. And Dante, I know she does. Serafina sat in her office in the dark, and she listened to the recording twice, and then she took the earphones out, and she sat very still for a long time. The affair had not created the conspiracy. The conspiracy had come first. Dante had not fallen into something with Celeste, and then, opportunistically, decided to take Actinium. He had planned to take Axiom. He had brought Celeste close to Serafina, cultivated the friendship, and engineered the trust because Celeste could study the architecture from inside the life. He had counted on pregnancy to change Serafina's priorities. He had counted on motherhood to make her slower, softer, easier to move aside. She had given him a son, and he had looked at that gift and thought, now. She set her phone on the desk. The room was very quiet. Somewhere in the estate, she heard a door close, probably the security detail making rounds, probably something ordinary, probably nothing. But she sat with the sound for a moment, in the house that bore his family name, surrounded by the life she had built, alongside a man who had been building a different plan inside the same walls. She was not going to cry. Not because she didn't feel it, she felt it completely, the full terrible weight of it, the way it rewrote every good memory with a new light that made the colors wrong. She felt it the way you feel something when your body has no choice but to acknowledge it. But she was not going to cry in this room, in this house, while he was still under this roof. She would pack in the morning. She would leave the day after that. She would take the legal folder and the laptop and the maternity clothes she had bought reluctantly and the governance, documents, and the evidence Jonas had already started compiling, and she would go somewhere that did not have his name on the walls. But first, she picked up her phone again. She opened the recording file Jonas had sent, and she forwarded it to Mara Ellison with 3 words in the subject line. It started earlier. She pressed send. And the point she had been approaching since 5:42 on a rainy Friday evening, the place past which nothing would look the same, past which the map of her life needed to be redrawn from scratch, was no longer ahead of her. She had already crossed it. She packed in the morning, the way she did most things methodically, without performance, starting with what was necessary and leaving sentiment for later. The maternity clothes went first. She had 3 bags worth by now, accumulated over 5 months in the reluctant, incremental way of someone who kept thinking they'd figure out a system and then bought another pair of elastic waist trousers instead. She folded them carefully, not because she cared about the folding, but because her hands needed something to do while her mind ran ahead to everything else. The legal folder went into the laptop bag. Her personal documents passport, the original Axiom incorporation paper she kept in a fireproof sleeve, the trust documents that predated her marriage by 3 years, went into a separate case she had bought for exactly this kind of need. A black case that looked like any other, and contained the architecture of her independence. She did not take jewelry. She did not take photographs. She took her work, her identity on paper, and the clothes for the body carrying her son. Dante appeared in the doorway of the bedroom at 7:52. He looked at the open bags on the bed. He looked at her. Where are you going? Not a question. A demand wearing a question's punctuation. I'm going to the Meridian, she said. It was a serviced apartment building 4 miles away that she maintained a unit in under Axiom's corporate lease, a detail from 3 years ago, originally intended as a space for visiting executives. that she had never relinquished, because something in her had always understood that a woman in her position needed a door that was entirely her own. Dante had known about the unit. He had never asked about it. She thought about that now. "You're taking my child out of this house," he said. She zipped the first bag closed. "I'm taking our child somewhere that isn't a war zone." "I haven't done anything, Dante." She turned and looked at him directly. "I have the recording from 14 months ago. I know when this started. I know why Celeste was in our house at our table, in my life." She picked up the bag. "So, don't stand in the doorway and tell me you haven't done anything." He went very still. That particular stillness, the one that meant he was recalibrating, rather than absorbing. She had seen it in negotiations across polished tables. She had once found it reassuring, proof that he was steady, proof that he was in control. Now she walked past him through the doorway, and he didn't reach for her, and she didn't look back. She was in the car by 8:15. She drove herself. She did not use the estate driver, and she did not tell the security detail where she was going. She disabled the secondary location tracker she had discovered on her phone 2 nights ago, a duplicate of the one she'd already turned off, installed at the application level rather than the system level, the kind that requires someone with specific technical knowledge to set up. She disabled it in the parking structure of a drugstore, 3 blocks from the estate. Sitting in the car with the engine running, looking at the app's interface for a long moment before she deleted it entirely. She sat there after she deleted it, watching the space in her phone's app list where it had been, and she breathed steadily for a while. Then she drove to the Meridian. The apartment was clean and impersonal in the way of corporate spaces everywhere. Good furniture, neutral colors, the particular smell of a place that was well maintained but not inhabited. She had been in it perhaps 12 times. She set her bags down in the bedroom and opened the curtains and stood looking at the street the window for exactly as long as it took her to decide that she was not going to allow herself to feel the full weight of what had happened yet, because the full weight of it would require time she did not currently have. Jonas arrived at 10. He had a battered canvas bag over one shoulder and the look of a man who had been up most of the night, not because he'd been asked calls, but because something in the data had snagged on something in his mind, and he couldn't stop pulling at it. She recognized the look. She'd had it herself in the early years of Axiom's development, when a problem in the routing logic would catch in her brain at 2 in the morning, and she'd end up at her desk until dawn, not from discipline, but from the inability to leave something unresolved. She handed him coffee without being asked. He took it and sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. "Before we go through what I found last night," he said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "The emergency incapacity clause in your pre-Revello trust. The one that protects operational control of Axiom in the event that you're medically unavailable. Do you know how specifically it was written?" She went still. "I know how I wrote it," she said. "Why?" Jonas turned the laptop to face her. She looked at the screen. She looked at the document on the screen, and she read it, and she felt the floor shift in a way that was not metaphorical, but almost physical, a lurch, somewhere behind her sternum that she had to breathe through before she could read it again. It was a legal memorandum, Dante's attorney's letterhead. Dated 4 months ago, 4 months, which meant drafted and commissioned 3 months into her pregnancy, which meant at a point when Dante knew she was pregnant and knew the pregnancy was progressing normally and knew she would eventually go into labor, and that labor could be complicated, and that complicated labor sometimes resulted in a period of medical incapacitation. The memo outlined a strategy. If Serafina Vale became medically incapacitated during or following childbirth emergency surgery, extended recovery, any period of documented inability to discharge her duties, Dante Revello, as her legal spouse, could petition the court for temporary operational guardianship of her business interests under a spousal emergency provision that existed in state law and was rarely invoked and was even more rarely contested. Because it was rarely contested, because the situations in which it could be invoked were situations in which the spouse was incapacitated and therefore not in a position to contest anything. The memo was annotated. The annotations were in Dante's handwriting. She recognized it the way you recognize something you have read. Thousands of times on birthday cards, on notes left on kitchen counters, on the margins of documents she'd brought home for a review. His handwriting, close and controlled, in the margins of a legal strategy for taking her company while she recovered from giving birth to his son. One annotation read, "Timeline works best if we're fully operational before she's back on her feet. 3 weeks minimum post-delivery." She looked at the screen for a long time. "How did you get this?" she said. "It was in the same backup server as the recording. Whoever archived that meeting archived everything from the same period. I don't think they knew what they were preserving." He paused. "Serafina." She looked at him. "Are you okay?" She thought about the question. She gave it the weight it deserved, which was more than most people gave that question. "Not especially," she said. "Keep going." She called Mara at 11. She sent the memorandum through the secure file sharing system Mara's office used for sensitive documents. She waited on the phone while Mara read it. 3 minutes of silence, during which she stood at the apartment window and watched a delivery truck pull up to the building across the street and a man unload boxes with the particular, focused efficiency of someone who just needed to finish the route and go home. She thought about what that felt like, finishing the route and going home. She couldn't remember the last time anything in her life had felt that simple. "This is extraordinary," Mara said. "I know. He planned to use childbirth as a window." "Yes. This changes the nature of what we're filing. This moves us from civil property dispute into territory that involves—" Mara paused, and Serafina could hear the particular quality of an attorney choosing words with surgical care. "Coercive intent. Premeditated financial exploitation. Potentially more." "I know. Can I ask you something personally?" "Yes. Is there any part of you that wants to stop this? Walk away from the consortium presentation, take a settlement, protect your son's relationship with his father, and just build something new?" Serafina thought about the answer, the way she had thought about Mara's earlier question. Honestly, without the performance of certainty she sometimes used in rooms where she needed to seem unshakable. "There's a part of me that's exhausted," she said. "Yes. But there's a safeguard stripped out of my architecture that makes an automated system dangerous during exactly the kind of emergency I just went through. And if Dominion Sentinel gets presented to that consortium and adopted by one hospital network one, and there's a real mass casualty event, and the system routes resources to the wrong patients because nobody thought they needed to stop and let a human look first." She stopped. "I can't walk away from that, even if everything else were different." A pause. "All right," Mara said. "Then we build the case." She filed for divorce on a Tuesday. She did not do it dramatically. She did not do it with Dante in the room, did not call him first, did not send a message. Mara filed the petition on her behalf at 9:17 in the morning, and by 10 o'clock it had been served to Dante's attorney of record. And by 11, Dante himself knew. He showed up at the Meridian at 2 in the afternoon. She had expected him. The doorman called up from the lobby she had left, instructions, precise ones, about who could be informed of her presence and who could not, and she told him to send Dante up. She put on shoes. She stood in the center of the living room, and she waited, because she was not the kind of woman who let a hard conversation find her sitting down. He looked worse than she expected. Not disheveled. Dante Ravello had never in his life been disheveled. It was not in his genetic vocabulary, but something behind his face had given slightly. A structural thing. The careful management of his expression was working harder than usual, and she could see the effort of it. "You didn't have to do it this way," he said. "I know other ways," she said. "I chose this one. You could have called me, given me the chance to—" "To what?" She kept her voice flat. "Negotiate? You've been negotiating since the moment I put the photograph between us. Every conversation since then has been you looking for a deal." "I'm not making a deal, Dante. I'm ending a marriage." He stood just inside the doorway, his coat still on, as if he hadn't fully committed to being in the room. "What do you want?" he said. "Tell me what you actually want, and let's talk about it like people." "I want Axiom Route intact, under independent governance, with the human review safeguard restored and documented. I want a frank record of every unauthorized export entered into the legal filing. I want Dominion Sentinel permanently terminated. She paused. And I want to be a mother without it being a tactical window. He flinched. It was small, but she saw it. That's not what. I have the memo, she said. Your handwriting in the margins, Dante? 3 weeks minimum post-delivery. I know what you were planning. I know when you planned it. I know what you thought my body becoming vulnerable would mean for my ability to protect what I built. She stopped. Breathed. You thought becoming a mother would make me easier to take from. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. I was protecting our son's future, he said. Finally. Like he had thought about it and genuinely believed it was the right answer. No, she said. You were protecting what you wanted our son to inherit. That's different. That's a completely different thing. He didn't say anything else. She could see him at the end of the argument, not at the end of his capacity, not broken, but genuinely without a move she hadn't already accounted for. She had accounted for all of them. She had accounted for them the way she accounted for everything, carefully, in advance, with the part of her brain that never turned off, even when the rest of her was functioning on grief and bad sleep and pregnancy and the particular heartbreak of watching love reveal itself as a strategy. He left. She stood in the center of the room after the door closed, and she pressed her palm flat against her sternum, for a moment, not dramatically, just checking in the way you check a wound to see if the bleeding has changed. Still there, different than yesterday, survivable. She went back to work. 3 days later, Jonas called. She was in the middle of reviewing the consortium's presentation agenda. Mara had obtained a copy through legitimate channels, a process that Serafina had not asked the details of when the call came through. She answered immediately. Talk to me. I found the final piece, Jonas said. Something in his voice was different. She had worked with Jonas long enough to have cataloged his vocal registers. This one she had only heard once before, when he'd uncovered a critical vulnerability in a client's system that the client had not known existed and had not wanted to know existed, but absolutely needed to. What is it? Celeste used a Ravello-connected security contractor to pull your prenatal screening results. She said nothing. The genetic report, the full panel. She accessed it through a private medical data broker who had a working relationship with one of Dante's people. The report was delivered to Celeste's personal email, and she forwarded it to Dante. And I have the forwarding chain, I have the broker's access record, I have all of it. She sat down. Not dramatically, simply made a quiet decision about whether this was still appropriate, and they voted no. Serafina, Jonas said carefully, I'm here. I need you to know that this is a serious violation. Medical privacy law, the prenatal data protection statutes, this isn't a gray area. This is unambiguous. Whoever facilitated the access is potentially looking at criminal referral. The sex, she said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. He knew the sex. Yes. She thought about the night Dante had set our son, the way she had frozen, the way she had run through the possibilities, a slip, a guess, the particular confidence of someone who believed in gender intuition and then dismissed them because she had told herself there was no way he could know something she didn't know herself. The genetic report had been sealed at her request. She had specifically asked not to be told. She had wanted the moment of finding out to be a real moment, not a fact received in a clinical office, while someone in a white coat explained chromosomes. She had protected that surprise carefully. He had stolen it anyway. Not because he needed to know, not because knowing changed anything meaningful about the pregnancy or the birth plan or any of the medical decisions that still lay ahead. He had pulled her most private medical information through a criminal chain of access because he wanted to know if he was going to have an heir before she was ready to tell him. Because control worked that way. Because when you believed everything around you was information to be gathered and leverage to be held, you didn't stop at marriage vows or business contracts. You didn't stop at the walls of a sealed genetic report. You reached through them because the alternative waiting, not knowing, letting someone else have information that touched something you considered yours was intolerable. She pressed her free hand flat against her belly. Her son moved. A small interior shift The kind she had started to recognize over the past weeks, not the dramatic rolling kicks of earlier months, but a more deliberate repositioning, like someone adjusting in their sleep. Serafina. Jonas again. Steadier now. I want you to hear me. This is not just evidence for the civil case. This goes to Mara, and this goes to the district attorney's office. This is potentially criminal prosecution. The contractor, the broker, Celeste, all of them. And Dante. A pause. And potentially Dante, depending on what we can prove about his direction of the access. She sat there in the quiet apartment, with the sounds of the street coming through the windows she'd left cracked open for air, and she felt the full shape of what had been done to her spread out in her mind like a map she hadn't wanted to read. The affair had felt like betrayal. The theft of Axiom had felt like a violation. The memo about using her childbirth as a window had felt like something she didn't have clean language for yet. But this theft of something she couldn't get back, this reaching through walls she had built with her own careful hands to take a private moment she had intended to give herself and her son, this was a different kind of breaking. This was the breaking that told her exactly who she had been married to. Not almost. Not in the worst version of a man who was also sometimes good. Exactly. She removed her wedding ring. She was not sure when she had decided to do it. She did not decide exactly. Her right hand moved to her left, and her fingers found the ring, and she slid it off, and she held it in her palm and looked at it gold, simple, the one she had chosen herself, because Dante had offered something more elaborate, and she had not wanted elaborate. She had wanted simple. She had wanted something that looked like a decision rather than a display. She set it on the kitchen table. Jonas, she said. Yeah. Send everything to Mara tonight. All of it. The broker chain, the forwarding record, the contractor's access log. Everything. Already compiling. And the modification to the safeguard I need. That documented in a format that can be presented to a non-technical audience. Hospital administrators, investors, consortium representatives who have never looked at routing architecture in their lives. I need them to understand exactly what was removed and exactly what it means for a real patient in a real emergency. I can have a lay language summary by Thursday. Wednesday. A pause. Wednesday. Thank you, Jonas. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table with the ring beside her hand, and the late afternoon coming through the windows, and she stayed very still for a long time. Not because she was paralyzed, not because she was breaking, but because she was very deliberately letting herself feel the whole of it before she moved again, the grief for the marriage, the fury at the theft. The particular cold horror of knowing her son's genetic information had traveled through criminal hands before she herself had chosen to receive it. She let all of it be real, because she had learned, in 12 years of building things in a world that wanted her to be smaller, that the only way to move cleanly was to acknowledge the full weight of what you were carrying. She sat with it. Then she picked up the ring. She carried it to the bedroom and placed it in the black document case, alongside the Axiom Incorporation papers and the trust documents and the other things that constituted the architecture of who she was. Not because she might need it, because it was still part of the record. Because what had been done to her deserved to be documented completely, without erasure, without the soft revision that grief sometimes performs on the truth. She went back to the kitchen table and opened the consortium agenda. 22 days until the presentation. The safeguard documentation would be ready Wednesday. The forensic chain on the prenatal records was already being compiled. Mara was building 3 simultaneous legal motions. And Dante and Celeste were still walking through a door that Serafina had left open on purpose, still filing materials into a platform built entirely from her stolen work, still believing, as far as she could tell, based on everything Jonas was monitoring, that the door would stay open until the morning of the presentation and then swing shut in a way that could be negotiated around. They did not know about the trust. She had set up the Emergency Governance Trust 7 years before marrying Dante. A lawyer in Philadelphia, recommended by a professor she'd had in graduate school, someone with no connection to anyone in her current life. The trust was designed for exactly the kind of vulnerability she was now facing: illness, coercion, incapacity, or the legal claim of a spouse, and it vested operational authority in a three-person independent board, not in any individual, not in any partner, not in any family member by marriage. She had never mentioned it to Dante, not out of deception. Out of the simple, early career, understanding that there were things a woman building, something serious needed to protect before she understood exactly what threats would eventually materialize. She had protected against the general category of threat because she had not yet met the specific one. Dante had spent months preparing for her weakness. The younger version of her, sitting in a Philadelphia law office with a concept and a prototype and no husband and no son on the way, had already prepared for her freedom. She opened her laptop. She drafted an email to the trust's independent administrator. She explained the situation in clean, precise language, the theft, the modification, the medical privacy violation, the spousal guardianship memo, and she requested that the board convene an emergency session. She requested that the session be held before the consortium presentation. She pressed send. Then she leaned back in her chair in the apartment that bore no one else's name, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought about a room full of hospital executives and security officials and investors and consortium representatives, and Dante standing under bright lights at a podium, and the particular expression she imagined on his face in the moment when the door that he believed was still open revealed itself to have been, all along, a wall. She was not going to stop them before the presentation. She was going to let them walk to the edge of everything they had stolen. And then she was going to be standing there when they arrived. The 22 days passed the way the last weeks, before something irreversible always passed slower than they should, and then suddenly gone. Serafina tracked them the way she tracked everything, in increments, in deliverables, in the specific satisfaction of watching a structure she was building become more solid with each passing hour. Mara filed 3 motions in 2 courts, both sealed at Serafina's request. Jonas completed the lay language summary of the safeguard modification by Wednesday, as promised, then spent the following week building a visual demonstration that could be projected on a screen large enough for a ballroom. The Independent Governance Board convened its emergency session on a Thursday morning in a conference room in Philadelphia, and when it was over, the Trust's operational protocols were fully activated and documented and ready. Serafina attended the board session by video. She was 26 weeks pregnant by then, and her obstetrician had asked her to minimize unnecessary travel. She sat in the Meridian apartment in front of her laptop, with her hands folded on the table, and she walked 3 people she had chosen years ago, a retired systems engineer, a former federal prosecutor, and a woman who had built and sold 2 logistics companies through everything that had happened, without editorializing, without asking for sympathy, presenting the facts in the sequence they had occurred, and letting the facts do what facts did when arranged with precision. The board voted unanimously. The trust protocols would activate at a time of Serafina's choosing. She thanked them. She closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet apartment and ate the lunch she had been ignoring for 2 hours and did not feel triumphant, because triumph was not the right word for preparing to dismantle a life you had believed in. The night before the consortium presentation, she did not sleep well. This was not anxiety, or not only anxiety. The baby had shifted position sometime around midnight into a configuration that pressed against her lower ribs in a way that made deep breathing difficult, and she spent the hours between 12 and 3 repositioning herself with the methodical persistence of someone who has accepted that comfort is no longer structurally possible and is simply looking for the least uncomfortable option. She tried the left side. She tried the right. She tried a configuration involving 3 pillows that her midwife had demonstrated, and that worked for approximately 11 minutes before stopping working. At 3:15, she got up and made herself warm water with lemon and stood at the kitchen window in the dark and looked at the street below. 1 cab moved through the intersection. A man walked a dog, some large, unhurried breed that moved with the dignity of an animal that understood the city belonged to it between 3 and 4 in the morning. A light was on in the building across the street, 4th floor, the specific warm rectangle of someone else also not sleeping. She stood there and thought about what the morning was going to require of her. She was 26 weeks pregnant. She had been sleeping badly for 3 weeks. She had spent the last month in a sustained state of controlled adrenaline that her body was beginning to present into invoices for a persistent tightness across her shoulders, a pressure behind her eyes that no amount of water fully resolved, a tendency for her hands to shake very slightly when she'd been working for more than 4 hours without standing up. She was not fragile. She had never once in her adult life described herself as fragile and meant it. But she was a human woman in the 3rd trimester of a high-stress pregnancy who was about to walk into a ballroom and publicly dismantle the cover story of the most dangerous man she had ever loved. She thought about that clearly, without softening it. Then she finished the warm water, went back to bed, and slept until 6. The Hartwell Grand was the kind of hotel that existed specifically for events of consequence, the kind where the ballroom ceiling was high enough to make a person feel appropriately small, where the chandeliers were calibrated to be impressive without being distracting, where the chairs were uncomfortable in the precise way that communicated, "Pay attention, this matters." The International Security and Medical Consortium had been meeting here for 11 years. Serafina had attended twice before as an Axiom founder, once as a presenter and once as a panelist, and she knew the layout of the space the way she knew the layouts of most spaces she had worked in, from the inside, through experience, with attention to where the exits were. She arrived at 8:45. The presentation was at 10. She had dressed carefully, not in the way of someone performing confidence, not in the way of someone who understood that the body you present to a room sends information before you open your mouth, and that she was going to need the room to receive the right information first. Dark charcoal, structured, the kind of maternity dress that acknowledged the pregnancy without centering it. Low heels, because she was on her feet for 3 hours, and her judgment about what her ankles could handle had become aggressively realistic. Hair pulled back. No jewelry except the single pair of earrings she had bought herself the year. Axiom's cleared its first million in operating revenue, small and precise and hers. She went to the registration desk and collected her badge. The woman behind the desk looked at her name, then at her face, then at her name again, with the particular expression of someone who has recognized a name from recent news coverage and is not sure what the etiquette is. Serafina smiled pleasantly and took the badge. Mara was already inside, near the back of the pre-session reception area, in conversation with a woman Serafina recognized as the consortium's general counsel. Mara did not look up when Serafina entered. They had agreed, for reasons of optics and strategy, to move through the morning as separately as possible until the moment arrived. Jonas was in the AV room. He had been there since 7. He had a laptop, a backup laptop, 3 separate drives containing copies of the evidence, and a direct line to the consortium's technical coordinator, who had agreed under terms that Mara had negotiated with the consortium's leadership 2 days ago, in a private meeting that Serafina had not attended to allow a presentation addition during the morning session. The consortium's leadership knew what was coming. Specifically, they knew that there was a material dispute regarding the intellectual property underlying Dominion Sentinel, and that they had been asked to allow parties to present, and that the decision about how to proceed with the platform would be made following the presentations. They did not know the full scope. They did not know about the safeguard modification. They did not know about the prenatal records. They did not know about the recording or the memo. They were about to. Dante arrived at 9:10. She saw him from across the reception area. He came in through the main entrance with 2 associates, not soldiers, not obviously, but men who carried themselves with the specific alert stillness of people whose professional function was to be aware of threats. He was wearing a gray suit. The one she had once told him made him look like a man who had already won whatever he was attending. He had apparently remembered this. Celeste was beside him. She looked good. That was the honest observation, and Serafina had trained herself in the weeks since the hospital corridor to be honest about Celeste without editorializing. Celeste Marrow was an attractive, intelligent, professionally accomplished woman who had made a sustained and deliberate choice to betray someone who trusted her, and those two facts lived side by side without resolving each other. She was dressed in navy, structured, confident, 11 weeks pregnant, and not yet visibly so. Her expression was the expression of someone who had prepared extensively and believed the preparation was sufficient. Serafina watched them for a moment from across the room. The distance between them may be 40 feet and 3 months of destruction. Then she turned and went to find her seat. The session opened at 10:02. The consortium's chair, a gray-haired cardiologist named Dr. Philip Reese, who had been running this organization for 7 years, and who had the particular manner of a man who had presided over enough difficult meetings to have developed genuine patience for them, welcomed the room and introduced the morning's agenda. There were approximately 200 people in the ballroom: hospital executives, security directors, technology investors, attorneys, 2 journalists who covered the healthcare technology beat, and several representatives of family organizations whose names Serafina recognized from Dante's world. Dr. Reese introduced Dominion Sentinel. He introduced it carefully, with the language of an institution that was interested but not yet committed, promising developments in emergency routing automation, invited today to present before the consortium's full membership for evaluation. He did not say the word endorsement. She noted that. Then he introduced Dante Ravello and Celeste Morrow. They walked to the stage together. Dante took the podium with the ease of a man who had commanded rooms his entire adult life and found the mechanics of a corporate presentation considerably less demanding than most of what he'd done. He was good at this. She had watched him speak in rooms before, and she had always been proud of how he carried himself, how he held attention, how he made people feel that their listening was rewarded. She watched him now. He began. The presentation was polished. She had to give it that. The interface for Dominion Sentinel was genuinely beautiful, clean design, intuitive navigation, the kind of visual language that communicated sophistication without requiring explanation. Because beneath the interface were her bones, her routing logic, her decision framework, her 4 years of architecture, wearing a new name and a different skin. She sat in the 4th row with her hands folded in her lap, and she watched them present her work, and she breathed steadily, and she did not look at Mara, and she did not look at the door to the AV room, and she did not allow her expression to become anything other than the expression of a person listening carefully to a presentation. Celeste took over for the technical demonstration. She was good at this, too precise, authoritative, the kind of presenter who answered questions before they were formed, because she anticipated where confusion would arise. She ran the demonstration smoothly. The system's interface responded quickly. The performance metrics appeared on the screen behind her, and they were impressive, because they were always going to be impressive when you removed the part that slowed the system down on purpose, because slowing it down was the point. The room was attentive. Several people were taking notes. Dante watched from the side of the stage with the expression of a man who has decided the morning is going the way he planned. Dr. Reese returned to the podium when Celeste finished. "Thank you," he said. "Before we open for questions, I want to note that the consortium has received a request for additional presentation time from Axiom Root's founder, Serafina Vale, who has raised questions regarding the intellectual property underlying Dominion Sentinel. The board has agreed that both parties should have the opportunity to present before the membership this morning." He paused, in the way of a man choosing words in real time. "In the interest of the consortium's integrity and the safety of any system we consider for adoption, we felt this was the appropriate course." The room shifted, not dramatically a collective reorientation. The specific alertness of 200 people who had arrived expecting a product presentation and were now understanding they had arrived at something more complicated. Heads turned. Phones appeared in hands and then were put away as people remembered where they were. Dante's expression did not change, but his hands, which had been relaxed at his sides, moved. One went to his jacket pocket. He pulled out his phone and looked at it and put it back. The movement was small and controlled, and she watched it from the 4th row, and she thought, he didn't know the consortium's leadership had agreed to this. He thought he would be in the car before she had a chance to stand at a podium. She was already standing. She had already walked to the front of the room. She was already at the stairs to the stage. The room was very quiet when she reached the podium. She was visibly pregnant. She was standing alone, no husband beside her, no attorney at her elbow, no security detail behind her. Just a woman in charcoal with a badge that said founder and a posture that said something else entirely. She looked out at the room for a moment before she spoke. Not for effect, because the room deserved to be looked at. 200 people who worked in hospitals and security, and the infrastructure of emergency response people whose organizations might adopt whatever technology was presented here today and deploy it into real systems that served real patients. They deserve to have someone look at them before asking them to understand something important. "I'm going to show you a simulation," she said, "and I need you to watch it carefully." Jonas in the AV room activated the projection. The simulation began. It was a scenario she had designed herself 3 years ago as a stress test for Axiom's emergency routing protocol. A pregnant patient, 24 weeks gestation, presenting with abdominal pain and rapidly dropping blood pressure, symptoms consistent with internal bleeding, in a facility with 2 operating suites, 2 surgical teams, and competing emergency demands from 3 other patients on the floor. She narrated it quietly. She did not raise her voice. She explained what each variable represented: the patient's vitals, the competing resource requests, the system's decision architecture at each junction. She showed the Axiom response first. The system routed toward the pregnant patient flagged the ambiguity in the diagnostic picture. The symptoms could indicate 2 different emergencies, each requiring different resources, and stopped automated routing. It issued a mandatory hold and demanded senior human review before committing resources. The room was quiet. She heard someone in the second row exhale slowly. "The hold lasts 11 seconds, she said. "During those 11 seconds, a physician makes the call. Because the automated system has recognized the limits of what automated assessment can accurately determine in this scenario." She paused. Then she showed the Dominion Sentinel response to the same scenario. The system processed it without pausing. Clean, fast, confident. It routed resources to the patient, whose diagnostic picture was clearest one of the other 3 competing cases, because clarity scored higher in its decision matrix than ambiguity did, and the pregnant patient's presentation was ambiguous. The resources went to the wrong patient. The simulation showed what happened next in both scenarios. In the Axiom version, the physician's 11-second review corrected the routing, and the pregnant patient received emergency surgery in time. In the Dominion Sentinel version, the automated confidence was wrong, and the simulation ran forward 40 minutes, and she did not need to narrate what happened because the room was already completely silent and the people in it understood. She let the silence hold for a moment. Then she said, "This safeguard, the mandatory human review protocol, was designed into Axiom Route after 18 months of stress testing. It was not removed to make the system slower. It was not a flaw. It was a deliberate choice, made because automated systems operating at the edge of their diagnostic capacity will always choose confidence over uncertainty. And in emergency medicine, uncertainty is often where the patient lives." She clicked to the next slide. Someone removed it. She clicked again. This is the original source code for the routing architecture underlying Dominion Sentinel. The timestamp is from Axiom Route's development server, dated 14 months before Dominion Sentinel's registration as an entity. The code is mine. The architecture is mine. The safeguard removal is documented in the modification log, along with the credentials used to access the system and the device to which the modified files were transferred. She went through it methodically. Not fast, not slow, at the pace of someone who has built a case with precision and knows the case will hold. The access logs, the timestamps, the credential trail, the device registration, the export records. She heard Dante speak her name from somewhere near the stage stairs. She did not turn. She kept going. 23 unauthorized entries over 31 days. Temporary credentials issued in my name under my authorization for a specific and limited purpose. Repurposed without my knowledge to export the core of what I built into a platform registered in other people's names. She clicked to the final slide. It was a screenshot of a deleted message, recovered by Jonas from a backup server. The message contained one line, written in Dante's name to a technical contractor, strip Vale's branding before the council sees it. Once Dominion wins, ownership becomes negotiable. The room was not silent now. It was the kind of noise that 200 people make when 200 people are collectively recalibrating the shift of chairs, the murmur of people leaning to the person beside them. The specific percussion of a ballroom understanding that what it has been invited to is not a product presentation, but a reckoning. Dr. Reese was on his feet. Dante was on his feet. She turned to face him across the stage. He had come up the stairs. He was 10 feet from her, in the center of the stage, under the lights. He looked at her with an expression she could not fully name, not fury, though there was somewhere underneath it. Something more complex. Something that had calculation in it, and underneath the calculation something rawer that she thought might be, at the bottom layer, something like shock. The shock of a man who has planned extensively for one version of a person and discovered in a public room with 200 witnesses that the actual version was different. "This is not the place," he started. "Where would you like me to do it?" she said. Her voice was level. You chose a consortium presentation as the venue for claiming my work. I chose the same venue to prove it's mine. You're making allegations in front of. I'm presenting evidence, she said. There's a difference. You know what evidence looks like. You've been managing it for months. Celeste, from beside the stage, said something sharp and low to the man nearest her. One of Dante's associates moved toward the stage stairs. Jonas, watching the feed from the AV room, had already called Mara, and Mara was already speaking to the consortium security director, and the associate stopped. Dante, Serafina's voice dropped, not quieter, more direct. Just for him, though it carried in the silence. Tell them. In front of these people right now. Tell them who wrote the code. Tell them which of your devices the files were transferred from. Tell them when you created Dominion Sentinel's registration entity and where the seed documentation came from. He looked at her. Tell them, she said. He said nothing. Celeste said, from the floor below the stage, this is a distortion of a collaborative arrangement that... Celeste. Serafina turned to face her. Her voice was still level, still controlled, but she looked at Celeste fully, directly, with specific attention of a woman who had carried 12 years of trust for this person in good faith, and was now holding the forensic record of how that trust had been spent. Your device, your forwarding chain, your corporate email, receiving files from my restricted server at 11:43 on a Tuesday evening. I have the server log. I have the receiving confirmation. I have the modification timestamp showing what was changed after transfer. She paused. Do you want to tell them about the collaboration? Celeste's jaw tightened. She said nothing. Dr. Reese stepped forward. Mr. Ravello, with respect, the consortium requires a direct response to what's been presented. Do you claim to have authored the architecture underlying Dominion Sentinel? Dante stood under the lights. His hands were still. His face was controlled. He was doing what he did in rooms where everything had gone wrong, holding the composure, buying time, looking for the angle. There was no angle. She had made sure of that. I directed the development, he said finally. I provided resources. Did you write the code, Doctor? Reese said. He was not a man given to bluntness as a default mode, but he was a physician, and physicians learned to cut to the question. Did you write any portion of the code? Pause. No. Did you receive authorization from Ms. Vale to export the architecture and develop it under a separate entity? A longer pause. The arrangement was Mr. Ravello. No, Dante said. I did not receive explicit authorization. Celeste made a sound that was not quite a word. Dante turned and looked at her. And Serafina, watching them from 5 feet away, saw the exact moment when the private arrangement between them became exposed to the same light it had just been standing in front of when Celeste understood that the man beside her had just made his own calculation, and the calculation had not included her. You told me she'd agreed, Celeste started. This is not the place to discuss. You told me she'd agreed. Celeste's voice was no longer controlled. It was the voice of someone whose scaffolding has just been removed in a public space and who is experiencing the falling in real time. You said there was an understanding that the marriage made the property. Celeste, you said she knew. Her voice cracked. Not dramatically, just at one edge. You said she wasn't going to fight it because of the baby, because once she was a mother, she wouldn't. Stop talking. I said stop talking. Dante's voice dropped to something that had force without volume. She had heard that voice exactly once in 12 years, in a room with men who understood what it meant. It was the voice below the performance, below the negotiation, below the careful management. It was the voice that said everything else had been management. Celeste went silent, and in that silence, with 200 people watching, the partnership that had been built on the theft of Serafina's work collapsed publicly into the exact shape of what it was, two people who had not, in the end, been collaborating on anything except the management of a common target. Dr. Reese turned to the room. The consortium is calling a recess. All materials relating to Dominion's Sentinel are hereby frozen pending an independent forensic review. No files, no devices, no documentation to leave the building. I'm asking legal counsel from both parties to meet with the board immediately. The room began to move. Serafina stepped back from the podium. Her legs were steady. Her breathing was controlled. Her hands were not shaking, which she noted with the detached interest of someone monitoring a variable. She was 26 weeks pregnant. She had been awake since 3. She had just stood in a ballroom of 200 people and presented the evidence of her own life's destruction, calmly in sequence, without crying or faltering or losing the thread. And she was now standing on a stage with her husband 10 feet away, looking at her, with an expression she was going to have to find words for later, when she had time for later. He said her name, just her name. Not a sentence, not an argument. Just the word he had said 10,000 times in 12 years, in all the different ways a person says the name of someone they know completely. She looked at him. I was protecting. He started. Our son's future, she said. I know, you said that. Serafina, you keep calling control protection, she said. Because protection sounds like love. She picked up her folder from the podium. But love asks, she said. Control takes. She walked off the stage. The consortium recess lasted 40 minutes. Serafina spent it in a small meeting room off the main corridor, with Mara and the consortium's general counsel and a woman from the board's technical committee who had questions about the safeguard modification that required answers at a level of specificity that Serafina was glad Jonas was available by phone to provide. She sat in a chair that was slightly too low and drank water and answered questions and signed 3 documents that Mara had prepared and was glad, with a profound and specific gladness, that she had done the work before coming into this room. Mara, at one point, put a hand briefly on her arm. Just for a second. Neither of them said anything about it. When the general counsel left to return to the board, Mara closed the door. It's done, Mara said. For today. For today. Mara looked at her with the clear-eyed assessment of someone whose professional function was to see things clearly. You're going to need to go home and sleep after this. I know. I mean immediately after this. Not after the follow-up call. Not after the board releases its statements. Mara, you're 26 weeks pregnant and you've been running on. I know, Serafina said again. Not impatiently, just firmly. I know what I've been running on. I know what comes next. She looked at the closed door. Are they still in there? Dante's in a room with his attorney and 2 consortium board members. Mara paused. Celeste is in a separate room. Her attorney arrived about 10 minutes ago. I understand she's been demonstrative. Serafina thought about the sound of Celeste's voice cracking in the ballroom. You told me she knew. She thought about Celeste sitting across her kitchen table, 3 years of Saturday afternoons, the comfortable shorthand of a friendship she'd believed was real. She was used too, Serafina said. Mara looked at her carefully. To a degree, within limits. She made her choices. I know that. Serafina pressed her fingertips against the table for a moment, just grounding herself. But she was told things that weren't true. He told her there was an understanding. That I knew. That the marriage made it legitimate. She paused. He lied to her the same way he lied to me. Different lies. Same person doing it. That doesn't remove her legal liability. I know it doesn't. Are you telling me you feel sympathy for her? Serafina thought about it honestly. I'm telling you I understand the architecture of what he does. And Celeste was inside it the same way I was, for longer than she probably knows. She picked up her water. That doesn't mean I'm withdrawing anything. It means I understand it. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The Ravello Council meeting is scheduled for Thursday." "I'll be there. I'll be there," she said again. "Because there are 3 legitimate operations that depend on Axiom infrastructure, and innocent people work in those operations, and I'm not going to burn them because of what their employer did. But I need to be in that room to make sure the transition happens the right way." Mara looked at her for another moment. Then she nodded once and picked up her own papers, and that was the end of the conversation. The Ravello Council meeting was on Thursday. She arrived with Mara and Jonas and 2 representatives from Axiom's Independent Governance Board. She sat at a table she had sat at before, a long table, in a room she had been in before, for other reasons, in a different version of her life. The room was full of men who understood power the way they understood weather, not theoretically, but from having lived inside it long enough to know how it moved. She had prepared for this differently than she had prepared for the consortium presentation. The consortium presentation required evidence. The council meeting required something else, the specific fluency of someone who understood both the formal and the informal architecture of the room they were sitting in, who could speak to the legitimate business interests at stake without pretending the illegitimate ones didn't exist, who could be direct without being provocative and firm without being foolish. She was direct. She laid out the trust protocols in precise terms. 3 Ravello operations depended on Axiom infrastructure, a medical transport coordination service, an emergency supply logistics network, a hospital security communications platform. None of those operations had participated in the theft. None of the employees working in them had any knowledge of what their employer had done. Serafina had no interest in disrupting those services or harming the people who worked in them. But Dante's unilateral access to Axiom's systems was ending. That morning now, the independent administrators were ready. The protocols were already active. She watched Dante across the table as she said this. He had the expression of a man who has survived many rooms by being the most dangerous thing in them and has arrived in one where that calculation doesn't apply. Not because she was more dangerous. She was not dangerous in the way he was dangerous, had never operated in that register, did not want to. But because she was holding something he could not take. She had built it before she met him, and she had protected it with the specific, quiet, unspectacular discipline of a woman who had learned early that the only reliable protection was the kind you built yourself, before you needed it for a threat you could only roughly anticipate. He had anticipated her weakness. She had anticipated the general category of threat. The difference was sitting at this table. One of the older men in the room, she did not know his name, but had seen him in this room before, white-haired, the compact stillness of someone who had outlasted several versions of this organization, looked at Donna and said in a tone that was neither sympathetic nor hostile, "Is there anything in this that can be disputed?" Dante looked at the table. "No," he said. The word cost him something. She could see it. Not the admission itself. Dante had made strategic admissions before, in rooms like this, when the math required it. But the specific experience of making it in front of these particular people, in this particular room, regarding something that had been constructed over months, with the confidence of a man who believed he had accounted for everything that cost him something she could see in the quality of his stillness. The administrator from the governance board began walking through the handover protocols. The men around the table listened. Dante sat at the head of his table, in a room that had always been his, in a world that had always bent toward him, and the access he had built his strategy around disappeared one protocol at a time. And Serafina watched the faces of the men nearest him and saw the specific and almost imperceptible shift that happened when a room recalibrated around its center of gravity. Not collapse, not defection, just a slight, carefully invisible reassessment. The kind that would take months to show its full shape. The kind that began, in rooms like this one, with a single question that went unasked out loud, but moved behind every set of eyes. If he miscalculated this, what else has he miscalculated? She had not come here to destroy Dante Ravello. She had come here to make sure the thing he tried to take stayed hers. Those were not the same objective. He stared at her across the table. The room was still in motion around them, papers being signed, administrators exchanging documents, Mara speaking quietly with one of the Ravello attorneys in the corner. But across the table, Dante and Serafina were briefly alone in the specific way that people who have spent 12 years in close proximity can be alone in a crowd, in a clean. I was protecting our son's future, he said again. Lower this time. Just to her. She thought about the recording. She thought about once the baby comes, she'll step back. She thought about the memo with his handwriting in the margins. 3 weeks minimum post-delivery. She thought about Celeste's voice, she trusts me, and sees specific, deliberate architecture of bringing someone close to a person you intended to take from. She thought about the genetic report. She thought about sitting in the Meridian apartment, in the dark, holding her wedding ring, understanding that he had reached through walls she had built with her own hands to steal a surprise she had been saving for herself. She looked at him. I know you believe that, she said. She meant it. She was not being cold. She was being accurate. Because the most frightening thing about it, the thing she had been sitting with for weeks, in the quiet of an apartment that bore no one else's name, was not that he had done it cynically, without feeling, as pure calculation. It was that he had done it while believing, in whatever part of himself remained accessible to belief, that it was a form of love. That control at scale, control comprehensive enough to encompass her body and her business and her unborn son's chromosomes, was the same as protection. That if you held everything tightly enough, nothing could be lost. She had loved a man who had collapsed the distance between love and ownership so completely that he could no longer feel the line between them. That was not something she could fix. She gathered her papers. She stood around her. The council room was still in motion. The administrators were finalizing the last of the handover documentation. Mara was collecting signatures. The older white-haired man had begun a separate conversation with someone at the far end of the table. The conversation shifting in the way of rooms that are absorbing a change and beginning to move beyond it. She started toward the door. Behind her, she heard Dante say her name once more. She did not stop. Not because she was done grieving him. She was not done grieving him, and she knew she wouldn't be for a long time, because grief for a marriage doesn't wait for the marriage to deserve it. It arrives on its own schedule, indifferent to the evidence. She kept walking because she had learned in the specific school of the last 3 months that the difference between surviving something and being defined by it was a single repeated choice, to keep moving, to stay in the direction of what you were building, to not let the weight of what was behind you determine the speed of what was ahead. She reached the door. She pushed it open. The corridor outside was quiet and fluorescent lit and completely ordinary, and she stood in it for a moment, both hands pressing briefly against the swell of her belly, feeling her son shift and settle, and she breathed once, deeply, and she walked toward the elevator. Her phone buzzed. Jonas. Contractor referred to DA's office. Medical privacy violation. They're moving fast. She put the phone back in her bag. The elevator arrived. She stepped inside. The doors began to close, and in the narrowing gap she caught one last glimpse of the corridor behind her, the council room door. Still moving, the fluorescent quiet of a building that was, right now, in this moment, doing what buildings do, while the things that actually matter happen inside them, and then the doors. The elevator doors closed and she rode down alone. 14 floors. She counted them on the display panel without meaning to the habit of a mind that needed something measurable when everything else was in motion. The numbers descended and she stood with both hands at her sides and her breathing deliberate and her reflection faint in the brushed steel of the doors, a woman she almost recognized, rounder now than she'd been in years, carrying more weight than she'd expected, in ways that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. The lobby was ordinary. People crossing it, going somewhere, carrying things. the specific indifference of a building that processed human consequence without registering it. She walked through it and out through the glass doors and into the afternoon, which was cool and overcast and smelled like rain that hadn't decided yet whether to arrive. Mara's car was waiting. Mara herself appeared from the building entrance 30 seconds later, moving with the compact efficiency of someone who had been in difficult rooms for 30 years and had learned that the exit was as important as the argument. She got in the back seat beside Serafina without speaking. The driver pulled away from the curb. They rode for 2 blocks in silence, the city sliding past the windows. Then Mara said, "The DA's office called while you were in the elevator. They want the full chain of documentation on the prenatal records access by end of week. Jonas has it. I'll coordinate with him." She made a note. The consortium released a preliminary statement 20 minutes ago. Dominion Sentinel is suspended pending forensic review. They've asked both parties to submit to independent audit of all materials. Good. Dante's attorney has already requested a meeting. Monday. You can take that meeting, Serafina said. You don't need me in the room for the first one. Mara looked at her. Are you all right? The question landed differently than it had in the meeting room earlier. Less procedural, more like the question a person asked when they actually wanted the answer. I'm very tired, Serafina said, and I need to eat something. And in about 4 hours, I'm probably going to feel the full weight of today, and I'm going to need somewhere quiet to do that. She looked out the window. But right now I'm all right. Yes. Mara nodded. She wrote something else in her pad and did not ask anything further, and Serafina was grateful for exactly that. She slept for 11 hours. She didn't plan to. She actually ate, the first real meal in what she realized, adding it up. Had been about 36 hours, and she sat on the couch in the Meridian apartment with her shoes off and her feet up, and she thought she would rest for an hour and then answer the 12 emails she'd been ignoring since the consortium presentation. She woke up at 6:15 the next morning, with the lamp still on and her phone face down on the cushion beside her, and a crick in her neck from the angle and the particular disorientation of someone who has slept deeply enough that the world has had to reconstruct itself from scratch. She lay there for a while, in the early gray light, not moving. The baby was still. He had a morning pattern she'd been learning active from roughly 5 to 7, then a long, quiet stretch, then the afternoon rolling. Right now he was in the quiet stretch, the particular interior calm of someone who had not yet been informed about what was happening outside. She pressed her hand flat against her side. She thought about Dante in that council room, saying no in response to whether the evidence could be disputed. The specific quality of that word. The way it had cost him something she could see, but couldn't name precisely not his dignity, because Dante Ravello's dignity was architectural and didn't collapse from a single load-bearing word. Something smaller and more specific, the loss of a story he had been telling himself about what kind of man he was. She did not feel triumphant about it. She had expected, somewhere in the preparation for all of this, that the moment the leverage shifted would feel like something. Like relief at minimum. Like the release of pressure that comes when you've been carrying something for months and you finally set it down. Instead, what she felt was a deep and specific exhaustion that had nothing to do with the pregnancy, and underneath the exhaustion, something quieter that she eventually, lying on the couch in the early morning, identified as grief. Not for the marriage. She had been grieving that for longer than she'd known. Possibly since the recording, possibly since the photograph in the hospital corridor, possibly since some earlier moment she didn't have clean access to yet. For the version of herself that had believed in it. That was the thing you lost that didn't get named in legal proceedings. The trust you had extended over 12 years, the specific faith of choosing to love someone completely and without the constant hedging of suspicion, the way you had to have been open to have been hurt. This way you couldn't have been injured to this depth without having been that open first. And the openness was not a mistake. It was not naivete. It was the thing she was most reluctant to let the experience take from her. She was not going to let it take that. She decided that clearly, in the early morning light, the way she had made other decisions not dramatically, not with the performance of resolve, but with the quiet finality of someone who has thought something through to its actual end. Then she got up, made water with lemon because she still couldn't have coffee, and answered the 12 emails. The divorce proceedings moved through the legal system with the impersonal efficiency of a process that had been designed for exactly this kind of complexity and had no particular feeling about it one way or the other. Mara's team was thorough. Dante's attorney was, as expected, very good and built the most defensible case the available materials allowed, which was less defensible than it would have been without the access logs and the recording and the memo with the handwriting in the margins, but was still constructed with professional craft. There were 3 hearings over 6 weeks. Serafina attended 2 of them. She sat in courtrooms with the posture of someone who had been in difficult rooms before and understood that her job in this particular room was to be present and clear and not to confuse her feelings with her argument. The terms that emerged were specific and bounded. Axiom root remained entirely hers under independent governance, with the human review safeguard restored and documented. No marital property claim could attach to it, the acquisition agreement's carve-out held, reinforced now by the evidence of unauthorized access that made any claim of collaborative development untenable. The emergency trust protocols remained active. Independent administrators maintained oversight of the shared infrastructure that the Ravello operations depended upon, with clear separation of her property from his. Dante retained his legitimate empire. The things that were genuinely his, the businesses he had built, the network he had constructed, the world he had operated in before she came into it, those remained his. She had never wanted to destroy them. She had wanted her own work back. Those were different objectives, and the proceedings reflected the difference. Custody arrangements for their son were structured with the care of 2 attorneys who understood that the child was not leverage, and that both parents needed clear expectations and protected access. Communication between Serafina and Dante regarding their son would be structured, documented, consistent, mediated through a family attorney for the first year. Not because either of them was incapable of a conversation, but because the last 3 months had demonstrated that their conversations, left unstructured, tended to become something else. Serafina had agreed to this without resentment. She was 31 weeks pregnant at the final hearing. Walking into the courthouse, she caught her reflection in the glass of the entrance doors, the particular physical reality of a woman in the final stretch of pregnancy, heavier in her movement, slower, but carrying herself with the upright deliberateness of someone who had made a decision about what their posture was going to communicate, regardless of how their body felt. She looked at her reflection for exactly 1 second. Then she pushed through the door. Cassian Rourke called on a Wednesday afternoon in the 7th month. She almost didn't answer. Not because she had any hostility toward him. She had thought about him, actually, in the months since the hospital corridor, thought about the specific quality of his response in that elevator, the absence of full performance in it, the single question that had given her exactly the room she needed. She had thought about it and also held it alongside the fact that Cassian existed within the same world as Dante, had connections there that she would never fully map, and that people in that world had a way of making their presence feel like support, when it was sometimes something more complicated. She answered. "I owe you something," he said, without preamble. His voice sounded the way it had in the elevator, careful, precise, aware of its own weight. "What do you owe me?" During the investigation, there was something I knew that I didn't bring forward immediately. A pause. "I had information about the contractor who accessed your medical records. I knew of him. I had a connection there that I could have disclosed earlier, and I didn't, because disclosing it would have put me in the investigations field, and I didn't want to be in the investigations field." She was quiet for a moment. "You eventually disclosed it." "To Jonas. 3 weeks in, after you'd already found the chain through other means. So the disclosure didn't materially affect the outcome." "No, but I sat on it for 3 weeks while you were building the case without it. And I did that because it was convenient for me, not because it was right." He stopped. "I wanted you to know that I know the difference." She sat with that for a moment. The honesty of it not the confession, which was easy enough to make once it didn't matter, but the specific, unsentimental way he delivered it, without asking for absolution, without framing it as something that redeemed him. "Why are you telling me now?" she said. "Because I've been keeping a distance I thought you needed, and I wanted to make sure that distance wasn't actually about avoiding an uncomfortable conversation." Another pause. "It was, so I'm having it." She looked at the window. The afternoon outside was doing something complicated, with the light overcast, but not dark, the specific ambiguous gray that wasn't quite any season. "I appreciate that," she said, and she meant it precisely. "Not more than it was, not less. How are you?" 31 weeks. "My ankles are doing something I don't have good language for. Beyond that, I'm building something. Axiom's governance restructure is almost complete. The new board is strong. We're expanding the emergency medical network into 4 new hospital systems in the fall." She paused. "I'm building something. That's the most accurate answer." "Good," he said, and it sounded like he meant that too, precisely. They ended the call without arrangements, without plans, without the forward-reaching language of people who are trying to establish something. And that absence felt, to her, more honest than any promise would have. The contractor who had accessed her prenatal screening results was dismissed from his position and referred to the district attorney's office within 2 weeks of the consortium presentation. The referral moved through the system over the following months with the grinding impersonality of legal process, and the outcome a criminal charge related to unauthorized medical data access, and a separate civil action came down 5 months after the referral, long after Serafina had stopped tracking it daily and moved it to the peripheral awareness of something that was being handled. Celeste Marrow lost her position at the Ravello organization within the month following the consortium. She retained her medical coverage. Serafina had been specific about that in the dissolution discussions, specific and unmoved when Dante's attorney had suggested it was a generous provision given the circumstances. Celeste's unborn child had not been present for any of the decisions made by the adults around her. That was Serafina's only position on the subject, and she held it without drama. She did not contact Celeste. She did not know whether she ever would. That was one of the things she had put in the category of questions that did not require an answer right now. A category she had developed over the preceding months, with something approaching genuine having learned that not every wound resolved at the speed of a legal proceeding. Dominion Sentinel was permanently terminated. The consortium's forensic review concluded in 6 weeks, and its findings were released in a summary document that was, by the standards of such documents, unambiguous. The architecture was Axiom's. The modification to the safeguard was documented in full. The summary noted, in language that was careful but not soft, that the removed safeguard had represented a meaningful patient safety protection, and that its removal in the interest of performance metrics had been a serious error regardless of the circumstances of the platform's development. Serafina read the summary when it was released. She read it in her office at Axiom's expanded headquarters, at a desk that was hers, in a building that was hers, surrounded by the infrastructure of something she had built from a concept in a notebook. She read the section about the safeguard twice. Then she sent a brief email to the new governance board, scheduling a presentation on the safety protocol expansion she had been developing since the consortium. She had been working on it in the spaces between everything else, the legal proceedings, the physical demands of the final trimester, the slow and deliberate reconstruction of a life, working on it the way she worked on most things she cared about, incrementally and persistently, and without waiting until conditions were ideal, because conditions were never ideal, and the work needed doing regardless. She pressed send. Then she put both hands flat on the desk and breathed once, deliberately. She went into labor on a Thursday night, not dramatically. She was in bed, had been for an hour, reading a document she'd been meaning to get through for 3 days, when the first contraction arrived with the specific quality of something that was not a question. She lay still for a moment and timed it mentally, and then got up and called her midwife, who answered immediately and spoke in the calm, unhurried tone of someone who had done this many times, and understood that calm was itself a form of support. She called Mara next, because Mara had insisted on being on the call list, and Serafina had agreed without embarrassment, recognizing that there was a difference between needing help and being unable to build something without it. She did not call Dante. That was not part of the agreement. The agreement specified that he would be notified when the birth was complete and stable, and that he could meet his son under the terms they had established, at a time and place that protected everyone involved. She had been clear-eyed about this when they negotiated it, and she remained clear-eyed about it now. Standing in the Meridian apartment at 11:47 on a Thursday night, with her go-bag already packed, and a contraction moving through her like a slow tide. The labor was long. She had been told it might be, and she had prepared for it, intellectually, and discovered, as most people discover, that intellectual preparation and physical experience are not the same territory. 14 hours. Not dangerous. Her midwife and the attending physician at the birth center moved through each phase with the focused competence of people who had done this enough times that their competence had become something she could actually lean on, which was what competence was for. She did not think about Dante. She did not think about the consortium or the legal proceedings or the recording or the photograph in the hospital corridor. She thought about her breathing, because breathing was what was required, and she thought about the specific and immediate work of her body, which was the most present she had felt in months. Lucien Vale Ravello was born at 2:14 in the afternoon on a Friday. He was 7 pounds, 4 ounces. He had dark hair and an expression of profound displeasure at the new situation he found himself in, which she thought was reasonable given the circumstances. He screamed with the specific authority of someone who intended to be heard. She laughed. She had not expected to laugh. She had expected to cry, had assumed that was the thing that happened, and maybe it did for other people. But what moved through her when they placed him against her chest was not grief or relief, or any of the large-named emotions she'd been anticipating. It was something simpler and more complete. Recognition. The specific feeling of meeting someone she already knew. She pressed her lips to the top of his head. "Hi," she said quietly. Just that. No speech. No ceremony. His screaming subsided into the compressed, searching sounds of a newborn calibrating its new existence. She held him and breathed, and outside the window it was raining. Dante met his son 12 days later. The meeting happened at a family attorney's office. Neutral space, structured environment, the terms they had agreed upon, the terms they had observed with the precision that both of them, whatever else was true, brought to agreements they had signed. Serafina arrived first. She sat in the waiting room with Lucien against her shoulder and looked at the window and thought nothing particular for 7 minutes. Then Dante came through the door. He stopped when he saw them. Not dramatically, just a pause. The specific hesitation of a man whose controlled presentations has encountered something it had not fully prepared for. She watched it happen across his face, the management falling briefly away, replaced by something less curated, something she had not seen on him before in precisely this form. He crossed the room. He sat in the chair beside hers. He did not reach for the baby immediately. He looked at his son for a long moment, at the dark hair and the small fist curled against her shoulder, and his jaw moved once in the way of someone pressing down on something they are not going to say out loud. Then he said, "He's real." It was a strange thing to say, and she understood exactly what he meant by it. There was a difference between knowing something intellectually and encountering it as a physical fact. Lucien was a physical fact, small and warm and breathing at a rate that still struck her as slightly improbable every time she checked. "Yes," she said. "Can I?" She transferred Lucien carefully, with the practiced efficiency of 12 days of constant handling, into his father's arms. She watched Dante receive him, watched the specific recalibration of a man's body when it is holding something it knows matters more than it can immediately process. His hands, which had never in 12 years of marriage seemed uncertain about anything they held, were briefly uncertain. He found the angle. He settled. Lucien made a small, compressed sound, and then was still. Dante's eyes, looking at his son, were wet. She did not look away. She watched it, because looking away felt like a form of dishonesty, like she needed to witness this accurately, needed to know that it was real, that whatever else he was also this. She did not reach for him. She did not speak. She simply let what was happening be what it was, without revision, without softening, without the false generosity of pretending the preceding months occurred to her, and without the false harshness of pretending. This moment wasn't exactly what it looked like. He cried quietly for a while, holding his son, and she sat beside him and watched out the window, and the attorney's office was very still. Eventually, Dante said, without looking up, "I'm sorry." She had thought about this, what she would say when he said it. She had turned the question over, in the way she turned difficult problems from multiple angles, without rushing to the resolution. "I know you are," she said. He looked at her then. There was something in his face that she recognized as an actual question, not strategy, not the calculation she had learned to see, but a genuine asking. "Is that enough?" he said. She looked at her son in his father's arms. "No," she said, "but it's real. And real things count, even when they're not enough." He looked back at Lucian. His hand moved to cup the back of the small dark-haired head in the careful way of someone who has understood, perhaps for the first time, what fragile actually means when it is applied to something you love. They sat like that for a while, not reconciled, not healed. Two people who had done serious damage to each other, sitting in a room, holding a child who had not asked for any of it, and deserved the best version of each of them that could be assembled from what remained. It was not a happy ending, in the way that phrase usually gets used. It was something harder and more specific than that. Axiom Fruit's expanded governance structure was formally ratified at a board meeting in the fall. The expanded emergency medical network launched across 4 new hospital systems simultaneously. The human review safeguard was fully restored and additionally documented, not just as code but as policy, as a formal safety standard submitted to the consortium's evaluation committee, which adopted it as a recommended protocol for all routing automation, used in emergency medical contexts. Serafina presented the policy at the adoption meeting herself. She was not visibly postpartum in the way she had imagined. She had expected a dramatic return to some previous physical state, and discovered instead that her body had simply become a different thing, one that had been through something significant and showed it in ways that were neither beautiful nor ugly, but simply true. She stood at the podium in a room considerably smaller than the consortium ballroom, and she presented the safeguard policy in the same clear, methodical way she presented everything. And the committee asked good questions, and she answered them. Afterward, one of the committee members, an emergency physician who had been practicing for 30 years, and who had the look of someone who had been tired for a long time and had decided to stop apologizing, for it came up to her and said, "This protocol, the hold on automated routing when diagnostic picture is ambiguous. I've been arguing for something like this for 6 years. I know," she said. "I read your published work on it when I was developing the original framework." He looked at her for a moment. "You read it. You were right. Automated confidence is not the same as accuracy. I built the safeguard because your argument was correct." He was quiet for a second. Then he shook his head slightly, in the way of someone processing something that is both satisfying and delayed. "Well," he said, "it's in the protocol now."
"Yes,"
she said. "It is." She drove home in the early evening light with the windows down, because the air had that particular quality that early fall produced, cool enough to feel like a change, without being cold enough to require anything from you. She thought about the 30-year emergency physician and his 6-year argument. She thought about how long it sometimes took for the right thing to get into the document where it could protect someone. She thought about Lucian, who was with the woman she'd hired as support twice a week, because she had accepted, with slightly more grace than she'd expected, that building something sustainable required sleeping occasionally. She thought about Cassian Rourke. He had called twice more in the months since the first call. Both times brief, both times substantive, once to tell her that the contractor's criminal referral had resulted in a charge, once to ask, without preamble, whether Axiom's expanded network had considered integration with a logistics system he'd been independently developing in the medical transport space. She'd looked into the system. It was good work, careful work, the kind that had a point of view about what it was trying to accomplish and had not compromised the point of view in order to look more impressive. She had told him so. He had said, "I'd be interested in your thoughts on the architecture, if you ever have time." She had said, "I might." She hadn't yet. Not because she wasn't interested, but because she was building a habit of moving at the speed of things she was certain about, and certainty, she had decided, was something worth waiting for. 1 year after the anniversary that ended her marriage, Serafina stood in Axiom's expanded headquarters on a late afternoon when the light came through the west-facing windows at the angle that turned everything briefly amber. Lucian was against her shoulder. He was 11 months old, and in the particular developmental phase of someone who had discovered that the world contained an essentially unlimited number of objects and that each of them was worth grabbing. He had his fist around the lanyard of her ID badge and was regarding it with the serious intensity of a researcher who had found a promising sample. The headquarters were full of people working. The particular productive sound of an organization that was doing something it believed in keyboards, low conversations, the occasional burst of laughter from the room where the routing engineers worked. A group that had developed, over the course of the past year, the easy camaraderie of people who spent a lot of time solving problems together. She had hired 3 of them herself, interviewed each one personally, asked questions that had nothing to do with their resumes, and everything to do with how they thought when they were uncertain. She walked through slowly, not managing, just present. This was something she had started doing in the past few months, moving through the building, not with an agenda, but with attention. The way you moved through a place you'd built when you wanted to understand what it had become. She stopped at the window at the end of the main floor. The city outside was doing what cities did in the early evening, accumulating light in the lower windows, traffic thickening, the particular layered movement of several million people in the process of transitioning one part of the day to another. Lucian released the lanyard and grabbed her collar instead. His grip was strong and definitive in the way of someone who had been alive for 11 months and already had opinions about what to hold on to. She felt, standing there, the specific quality of something she had been trying to identify for a while without having the right word for it. Not happiness exactly, though happiness was part of it. Not triumph, though she had built something real and protected it and refused to let it be taken. Not peace, because she was not a person at peace in the sense of being finished. She was working, always working, had 3 projects in progress, and a governance meeting Thursday, and a call with the emergency physicians research team at the end of the week. What she felt, standing at the window with her son's fist in her collar, and the city doing its evening thing, outside and the sound of her organization behind her, was something closer to presence. The specific, grounded, unremarkable weight of being exactly where you actually are, doing exactly what you actually chose, in a life that is genuinely your own. She had earned that, in the specific way that people earn things, not quickly, not cleanly, not without cost, but through the repeated choice to keep building when it would have been easier to reduce. She had spent 12 years in proximity to a man who had built his world by taking, and she had finally understood not intellectually, but in the deep and cellular way that experience teaches, that the things you built by taking were only ever as permanent as the leverage that held them. What you built by making, by the slow and imperfect and persistent act of creating something that hadn't existed before, was different. She was still building. The elevator at the far end of the floor opened. Cassian stepped out. He had been here twice before for meetings with the architecture team professional visits, each one navigated with the careful, deliberate quality of a man who understood that she was deciding something and was not going to rush the decision or try to shape it in his direction. He carried himself in the Axiom offices the way he carried himself everywhere she had seen him, without taking up more space than he occupied, without performing. He crossed the floor in her direction. He stopped a few feet away, the same distance he always maintained, and he looked at Lucian for a moment, the kind of look that contained genuine interest, without trying to perform it, and then he looked at her. The architecture review ran long, he said. Your team has opinions. That's why I hired them. Good opinions, he said. annoying, but good. Lucian, who had been studying the middle distance with the focused seriousness of a very young person encountering a stranger, shifted in her arms and made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite not a word. Cassian looked at him. Lucian looked back. Something passed between them in the specific way that very small people and reasonably honest adults sometimes recognized each other without agenda, without performance, just a mutual acknowledgement of presence. Cassian looked up at her. Ready? She had thought before that she would know when she was ready. That ready would feel like something an arrival, a clicking into place. She had spent a long time waiting for that feeling and had eventually understood that it was the wrong thing to wait for. Ready was not a feeling. Ready was a decision. Ready was the moment you stopped treating forward motion as a risk and started treating it as the thing you chose. She looked at Cassian. She thought about the elevator in the hospital, the rain on a Friday evening, a man holding a door open and asking one precise and useful question without trying to be the answer to it. She thought about everything that had happened between that moment and this one. The weight of it, the cost of it, the specific, irreversible education of a year in which she had lost things she'd believed in and kept things she'd built and brought a person into the world and understood, finally, the difference between a life that happened to her and a life she was actually running. Ready, she said. She was not escaping anything. She was not afraid of what was in the elevator. She was not moving forward because she had run out of reasons to stay still. She was moving forward because she was someone who built things, and there was more to build, and the person beside her was not offering to build it for her, but asking if she wanted to build in the same direction. And that was finally, simply, completely enough. She stepped forward. Lucian, against her shoulder, made his almost word sound again, more confident this time, as if he had decided that moving was agreeable and wanted it known. The elevator doors opened. They stepped inside, and as the doors closed behind them quietly, without drama, the soft mechanical certainty of something working exactly as it was designed to Serafina, Vale looked straight ahead at her own reflection in the brushed steel and did not see a woman who had survived something, though she had. Did not see a woman who had won something, though there were things she had fought for and kept. She saw a woman going somewhere she'd chosen. The doors closed. The building hummed around them, full of the work of people who were trying to do something that mattered, and the city outside continued its evening in the indifferent and magnificent way of cities. And somewhere in a hospital network that carried her name in its architecture, a routing system paused for 11 seconds in the face of an ambiguous diagnostic picture and waited, with the patience of something that had been built to know its own limits, for a human being to look and decide. And in that pause, in those 11 seconds of deliberate, protected human uncertainty, was everything she had ever believed about what it meant to build something right. The elevator descended. Serafina held her son, and for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, she was not waiting for anything. She was already there.